Gert van den Bosch, thank you for joining us in this group of politicians and doctors that are putting their personal time in to try and find the best way through this COVID-19 situation. And Gert, you've been quite prominent in being able to relate some of the concerns you've had very early on with a blanket rollout of some of the COVID-19 vaccines. Could you let us know what some of your main thoughts and concerns are going forward, and if you've got some ideas that might help?
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for having me. From the very beginning, as soon as I understood that the purpose was to do mass vaccination campaigns, so this is to vaccinate people across almost like all age groups of the population with a vaccine that we know cannot induce sterilizing immunity, cannot, in other words, prevent the transmission of the virus. It became pretty clear to me, based on some basic principles in immunology and evolutionary biology, that what we would in fact do is to drive and to promote immune escape. So what that means is that we all know that the virus is continuously mutating, and that there is variants produced. So those were already present before the mass vaccination. However, if you now generate a background of high immune pressure, which you basically do by vaccinating vast amounts of people in the population, then all of a sudden you give a competitive advantage to those variants that are capable of overcoming this immune pressure. So again, we have to realize the immune pressure is not capable of eliminating the virus, of killing the virus. So when you mount a high immune pressure, there are variants that have the capability to overcome that pressure, and who basically are gaining a competitive advantage on that background of high immune pressure. If this is only like a limited part of the population, that's not a problem, because the virus will soon be transmitted to other people who don't offer that competitive advantage to that particular variant. And again, the variant will be dominated by the parental strain, no problem. So that is why we don't see this kind of problems when, for example, we vaccinate vulnerable people against flu, or people, for example, the elderly. It is different when you start vaccinating large amounts of people, do mass vaccination, because then basically when the virus is transmitted from one immunized person to another, every single time it will again encounter this favorable environment where it gains a competitive advantage compared to the parental strain. And that is how basically you enrich the viral population with more infectious variants. And that is how basically the virus becomes ultimately dominant. So what we have seen, and what I always predicted, that in fact this game would end up in promoting, in fact, the expansion of more infectious strains. So we had the alpha, the beta, the gamma, the delta, etc. Some of them, most of them actually were already present, as I was saying before we started mass vaccination, but it was not that those variants were dominant. So we have seen that whenever we start mass vaccination campaigns, we see that the infectivity rate goes up. And that is simply due to the fact that more infectious variants become dominant, start to dominate in the population. So that is of course a serious problem, because you drive this higher level of infectivity up to a stage where ultimately the virus will could even become resistant to the vaccinal antibodies. And with the situation we have right now with the Omicron, that is basically already what we are seeing, that we have been breeding variants that have now a high level, in fact, of resistance to the vaccinal antibodies, which is of course very problematic. But not only that, also this mass vaccination, this is something which we have maybe been underestimating. They interfere with other immune defenses For example, it's very well known that we have also an innate immune system that can produce antibodies and that can even produce cells that are capable of killing virus-infected cells, like, for example, natural killer cells. And this part of the innate immune system plays a very important role in the defense against a number of viruses, for example, against coronaviruses, but also influenza viruses, and most likely also viruses like RSV in general. You could say against viruses that have an envelope and that are carrying glycans on the surface. And that is because these innate antibodies have, they are directed against glycans, glycans that are presented on our own cells, the body cells, but that have high level of similarity with a number of sugars, glycans, that are presented on viruses like influenza, like corona, etc. So these innate antibodies, they are fantastic because they are not specific. They do not recognize a particular corona variant. They can recognize a number of all different corona SARS-CoV-2 variants, including even other coronaviruses, and most likely also viruses like influenza virus. And this is because these antibodies recognize basically patterns. They recognize repetitive patterns of glycans that are simply shared amongst those viruses. So what is happening, and that is pretty dramatic, is that if you start immunizing people with, the type of vaccines that we are using, and you induce vaccinal antibodies that have high affinity for the virus, these antibodies can now outcompete the innate antibodies. And that is problematic because, as I was saying, these innate antibodies, they protect you against a number of viral respiratory diseases, like the coronavirus, like influenza, etc. And they are also self-protective. Not going to go too much in detail, but self-protective means that these antibodies, the primary role of these innate antibodies that you get as of birth, is that they will prevent antigens that resemble self-antigens, so antigens of your own body. They will eliminate those so that they don't lead to autoimmune disease. So you can imagine if you're now going to suppress these innate antibodies because you vaccinate people, and especially children, then of course there is a reasonable risk that you may be inducing a number of autoimmune diseases, and on top you will take away the protection of, for example, children against a number of viruses that normally cause infection in children, but that do not cause disease. For example, influenza is not a childhood disease. Coronavirus is not a childhood disease. And you substitute this kind of precious immunity by a very specific type of immunity, the vaccinal antibodies that we know already, and Omicron is the nicest current example, or no longer very active against this virus, or no longer really capable of neutralizing the virus. So that is a very dramatic situation, essentially because what we know as well is that this innate immunity, just like naturally acquired immunity that you get once you have gotten the disease and you recover from the disease, they have activity against a broad range of variants, and they can also use sterilizing immunity. Innate immunity can really eliminate the virus, and that is very important because that contributes to herd immunity. So that means that by vaccinating large parts of the population, you will also take away the opportunity for this population to develop herd immunity, because as we all know, as I was saying, the vaccines, they do not induce sterilizing immunity. On the contrary, they generate a breeding ground for more infectious variants to replicate and to transmit, because they offer them a competitive advantage. So it is in fact just the opposite of herd immunity. In other words, if you would ask me, to take some measures to prevent at any price herd immunity from establishing, then I would say, well, the best thing you can do is to vaccinate large parts of the population in the midst of a pandemic with vaccines that cannot induce sterilizing immunity, because then for sure you will generate a background on which more infectious variants will flourish. And as we have seen, this leads exactly to the opposite of herd immunity, namely an increase in the infection rate in the population. So these are the two major points I wanted to convey, that these mass vaccination campaigns have been largely, or those who have taken this initiative have been largely underestimating the evolutionary capacity of the virus to escape from an incomplete immune response. And secondly, that on top, they can also interfere with a very precious and very important part of the immune system, at least as far as coronaviruses are concerned, namely innate immunity, and thereby prevent, in fact, the population from developing herd immunity, exchanging a type of immunity that is sterilizing in nature for a type of immunity that is just doing the opposite and just basically offering a breeding ground to the virus, to more infectious variants to replicate and to transmit and to increase, in fact, in prevalence in the population. So the high infectious variants that are the result of this are extremely problematic. And if now, in contrast to the start of the pandemic, we see now children indeed that to some extent get a disease, the reaction to that or the solution should not be to vaccinate these children, because we know that the fact that they contracted disease is due to the high infectious pressure in the population. And so if we would not have these high infectious strains that are circulating, we would still have a situation like when the Wuhan strain came in, where basically children and young people and in fact all people who were in good health were not experiencing any problems. So that is the situation where we should try to get back to, but it's exactly the opposite. If we continue mass vaccination and the more we include new groups that have not been vaccinated so far, the worse it will be. I'll stop there for the time being, and please over.
All right, thank you, Gert. So I guess that that shows that the current vaccine rollouts could be, in fact, quite the opposite effect of what we want, encouraging more variants, promoting more infection and compromising immune systems, which is particularly concerning for the younger population as well, I suppose concerning for everyone.